We often think of danger as something that lurks in abandoned roads or dark forests. But sometimes, the real horror lives just a few feet away, behind the windows across the street. In this video, you'll hear 3 disturbing true stories about neighbors who seemed normal, until their darkest secrets came to light. I live in a quiet cul-de-sac in Boise, Idaho. One of those neighborhoods where people smile when they pass each other walking dogs or mowing lawns. Nothing ever really happens around here, and that's exactly how I liked it. About a year ago, a man named Gregory Flynn moved into the house next door. He was in his early 60s, graying, wore glasses, always had this stiff, formal air about him. Drove a beat-up blue Chevy Malibu, kept his lawn trimmed, waved politely when we crossed paths. He didn't talk much, but then again, most people didn't around here. What stood out, though, was how often he spent time in his garage. Every single night, right after sunset, he'd disappear into that cluttered space, shutting the garage door behind him. I'd sometimes hear faint sounds, metal clinking, drilling, maybe even a saw. At first, I thought he was just working on old furniture or restoring antiques, but then I noticed something odd. The garage lights were always dim, and even with the windows shut, a low rhythmic hum seemed to leak through the thin walls. And occasionally, a sharp metallic bang would echo, followed by absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. One evening, I took my dog Duke for a walk around the block and passed by Flynn's open garage. I slowed down, trying to sneak a glance without looking too obvious. What I saw made my stomach twist. Inside were rows of mannequins, maybe a dozen of them, human-sized, dressed in faded clothes, and all missing their eyes. Each one had small circular indentations in their foreheads, like someone had drilled holes there. Some had wires running out of their necks. I told myself it was just some weird art project, or maybe he sold props online. But a week later, a missing person alert popped up on my phone. A woman in her 30s had vanished not far from here. She lived just 2 blocks away. Over the next couple of weeks, Gregory's garage activity intensified. The hums grew louder. One night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a high-pitched screeching sound coming from his direction. I peeked through my blinds. His garage was still closed, but the light beneath the door flickered like a strobe. I considered calling the cops, but I had no real evidence, just bad vibes. I told my wife, who said I was probably overthinking it, but Duke, my dog, started acting weird too. He refused to go near Flynn's side of the yard, growled at the fence, tail tucked. Then something happened that pushed me over the edge. I was putting out the trash one night when I noticed a strong chemical odor, something like burning plastic mixed with bleach. It was coming from Gregory's backyard. I tiptoed around the side of my house and peeked over the fence. What I saw will never leave me. Flynn was standing over a fire pit, shoveling what looked like clothing and rope into the flames. Next to him was a large black trash bag, bulging, lumpy, half-zipped. He didn't see me, thank God. I backed away, heart pounding, and went straight inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I called the non-emergency line and filed a report. I didn't tell them everything, just enough to hopefully trigger a welfare check. The next evening, 2 officers showed up. I watched from my living room window as they knocked on Flynn's door. He answered, calm as ever, chatted with them for a few minutes. I saw him smile, nod, then shake their hands. No search, no arrest. That night, the garage stayed dark for the first time in months. A week later, Gregory Flynn vanished. Vanished. His car gone. House locked up. No forwarding address. Just like that, he disappeared. Police showed up eventually, this time with a search warrant. They taped off the property and spent 2 full days going through it. I stayed home, glued to the blinds, watching them carry out boxes and bags. At one point, they brought in a team with hazmat suits. That's when I knew whatever was inside wasn't just odd, it was horrifying. Rumors spread fast. Some said they found human remains in the crawl space. Others claimed he had dozens of IDs and passports, but no official statements were ever made. The house sat vacant for months, a silent blight on our peaceful street. Then, one afternoon, a realtor finally came to clean it out. Curious, and maybe stupid, I walked over and introduced myself. "I live next door," I said. "Mind if I peek inside?" She shrugged. "Just don't go in the garage." Still smells awful. I stepped into the house. Everything was meticulously clean. Too clean. No furniture, no dishes, no trash. Just empty rooms and echoes. But when I passed the hallway that led to the garage door, I stopped. The door had 4 deadbolts, all drilled into the frame from the inside. Like someone wanted to make sure whatever was in there could never get out. To this day, Gregory Flynn has never been found. And though no charges were ever filed, I know, deep down, that he wasn't just some quiet old man with a hobby. He was hiding something in that garage. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind picks up and rattles our fence, I swear I hear that same low hum, just barely. I was too young to remember any of it myself, but the story has stuck with my family for decades. We used to live in a quiet suburb outside St. Paul, Minnesota, in a modest 1-story home at the end of a tree-lined street. My parents were both in their late 20s when I was born, and by all accounts, life back then was simple and good, until the man across the street changed everything. His name was Mr. Whitaker, at least that's what everyone called him. He was a middle-aged guy, probably in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, wore khakis and tucked-in polo shirts, and had this calm, almost too polite way of talking. My mom once told me he brought over a small potted plant the day we moved in, a housewarming gift, and even offered to mow our lawn that summer when my dad injured his back. To most people on the block, he was just that helpful, quiet guy who kept to himself but always waved when you passed by. My parents said they never once heard him raise his voice. No loud parties, no arguments, just a man who kept his hedges trimmed, shoveled his driveway before anyone else in the winter, and never parked on the street. The kind of neighbor everyone hopes for, my mom used to say, until that day. One night, when I was just a baby, my dad was holding me in the living room, rocking me gently in his arms while watching the late news. The TV was tuned to a local channel, and they were broadcasting live aerial footage from a helicopter. At first, he wasn't really paying attention until something familiar caught his eye. Our street. He blinked. The news camera was focused on a house that looked exactly like the one across from us. He got up, still holding me, and called for my mom. Together, they walked to the window and looked out just in time to see it all happening in real life, not just on the screen. There were flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the houses, yellow police tape stretching across the front yard, and a group of officers standing on the lawn. Then, Mr. Whitaker was led out of his front door in handcuffs, his face blank and pale under the streetlights. A coroner's van pulled up shortly after. My mom still remembers the way the back doors opened and a man stepped out carrying what looked like a body bag. Then another, and another. We moved out 2 weeks later. For years, I didn't know what really happened that night. I mean, I grew up knowing that something bad went down across the street when I was a baby. My parents never hid the fact that it was the reason we moved, but they always danced around the details. It was something disturbing, my mom would say, or "you're too young to hear about it," from my dad. As I got older, I stopped asking. It became one of those vague, unspoken stories families carry in the background. Then, a couple of years ago, everything came out, completely by accident. It was during a Twins game, of all places. I had brought a few college buddies home for the weekend, and my dad took us to the stadium. He was feeling good that day. Maybe it was the beer, or maybe it was just being surrounded by young guys who reminded him of himself. But somewhere around the 7th inning, he started talking about that old house on Willow Lane. At first, we thought it was some neighborhood drama until he dropped the line that shut us all up. "You know, your mom and I used to live right across from a serial predator." We all stared at him. He took a sip of beer and leaned back like he was telling a ghost story. Guy's name was Charles Whitaker. Looked totally normal. The kind of guy who'd ask you about your car tires or bring your trash cans back from the curb if you forgot. Turned out he had a whole setup in his basement. Drugged men, chained them, did unspeakable things to him, until they stopped breathing. I didn't know what to say. I felt like my stomach had dropped into my shoes. One of my friends, Mark, half laughed, thinking my dad was exaggerating. Like torture stuff? My dad nodded. Worse. The news never gave all the details, but a buddy of mine from the department told me later it wasn't just torture. He built some kind of sick mechanical device, rigged up with gears and pressure triggers, used it to, well, you get the idea. He didn't just kill them, he violated them to death. The table went dead silent. It was hard to believe we had once lived across from that man, that my parents had spoken to him, trusted him, smiled at him, that he had seen me, an infant at the time, probably waved to me from his porch. And I couldn't help but think, how many times did he sit in his house, alone, planning his next victim, while watching my family through the blinds? It's been years since that night at the ballpark, but I haven't stopped thinking about what my dad told us. I remember getting home that night, locking every door and window in my apartment, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. I couldn't shake the image, my dad standing in the living room, holding me, rocking me to sleep, while just across the street, that man was probably doing unspeakable things to someone in his basement. I looked up old news archives and found vague reports of multiple victims discovered in a suburban home in Pennsylvania back in the early 2000s. No names were ever released. The neighborhood was never identified. But I recognized the blurred photo of the house immediately. It was ours. I couldn't find a mugshot of the guy. No follow-up coverage. It's like the whole thing was buried and forgotten. But that made it worse. It made it feel like the guy had simply vanished. Like the darkness in his basement had swallowed even the truth. I once asked my dad what happened to the house after we moved. He didn't say anything. He just got quiet, then changed the subject. I never pushed. But recently, out of morbid curiosity, I checked Google Maps. The house is still there. Same faded paint, same uneven walkway. But now it has a "for rent" sign out front. And every now and then, I catch myself wondering, do the new tenants know what happened in that basement? I hope they never have to find out the way my parents did. I used to think we lived in one of the safest, most uneventful neighborhoods in all of Colorado. It was one of those neatly arranged suburban areas just outside of Fort Collins. 2-story homes, freshly cut lawns, mailboxes decorated for every holiday, and the kind of quiet that made you feel like bad things only happened on the news, not here. Our house was on the far end of the cul-de-sac, and the guy who lived 2 doors down was someone we barely noticed, Mr. Dean Holloway. He was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, always wore the same neutral-colored windbreaker, and walked with a slight hunch, like he was trying to make himself smaller. You'd never see him without earbuds in, even while raking leaves or shoveling snow. Dean didn't talk much, and when he did, it was always polite but clipped, like he was measuring every word. He lived with his girlfriend Krista and her 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both under 10. They seemed like a quiet little family. Sometimes I'd see Dean walking the kids to the park down the street or bringing home big bags of birdseed. He kept these tall cages with exotic birds on their screened-in back porch. I thought it was kind of cool at first, until I realized he never let the kids touch them. It was like the birds were his and only his. My mom once told me Krista worked night shifts at the local ER, and she joked that Dean must have been a saint for holding down the fort while she was gone. I remember thinking that too. He always looked like the responsible one. Calm, controlled, maybe too controlled. I never saw him lose his temper, never heard yelling from their house, never saw anything out of place, until that one weekend in June. It was a Saturday afternoon when it all unraveled. I remember it vividly because I was home alone, watching a baseball game on TV, when I heard loud shouting coming from Dean's house. Not the usual neighborly squabbles or a raised voice over the phone. This was different. It was Krista, screaming, not in anger, in panic. I looked out the window and saw her storming out the front door with the kids, dragging a duffel bag behind her while yelling something over her shoulder. The kids looked shaken, especially the little boy who kept glancing back like he wasn't sure if they were really leaving. Dean followed them halfway down the front walk, but he wasn't yelling. He just stood there, arms crossed, staring as they got into her car and drove away. After that, the street went silent, unnaturally silent. Over the next hour, I noticed Dean pacing back and forth inside his house. The blinds were open, so you could see everything from across the street. Then, at some point, he disappeared into the back of the house. When he came back, he looked different, still quiet, but tense, robotic. And then came the sounds. Not yelling, not crying, squawking. It was the birds. One by one, I heard the shrieks echoing across the street, sharp and frantic, until they just stopped. It was like someone had hit mute on the world. Next, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Through the glass doors of the back porch, I saw Dean carrying what looked like a black trash bag. He tossed it into a plastic bin, wiped his hands on his pants, and calmly walked back inside. A few minutes later, smoke started rising. At first, I thought he was just burning leaves or garbage, but the smoke was thick and black, pouring from the attic vents and back windows. Then came the flames, orange, violent, and fast. Our neighbors came running out of their houses, calling 911. I grabbed my phone and backed away from the window just before it shattered inward from the pressure. The heat from Dean's house was so intense that it cracked multiple windows on our side of the street. Sirens howled in the distance, but Dean, he just stood on his lawn, watching it all. His face was calm, empty. When the fire trucks arrived, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just let them cuff him right there on the grass while smoke billowed behind him and flames devoured his home. The days that followed felt like we were living in the shadow of a nightmare no one wanted to talk about. The street was quiet again, but this time not in a peaceful way. The air felt contaminated. The scorched skeleton of Dean's house stood behind yellow caution tape, blackened and hollow, with parts of the roof caved in. It looked like something out of a war zone. The lawn, once manicured, was now dead and trampled. Police cars were parked out front for days, then disappeared. We never saw Krista or the kids again. Rumors floated around that she had moved out of state to be with family. Others said she was in hiding. No one really knew. I was just thankful she left when she did, because if she hadn't, we might have been watching a different kind of tragedy unfold that night. We heard Dean was denied bail, something about the danger he posed to himself and others. The local news covered the fire, but only briefly. They focused more on the property damage and animal cruelty charges, barely mentioning his name. Maybe they thought it was better that way. Maybe they didn't want to dig too deep. But for those of us who lived across the street, we couldn't just forget. My family replaced the broken windows, repainted the siding that had blistered from the heat, and tried to move on. But every time I looked out the front window and saw that charred lot, I remembered the man who once brought us a plant in a little clay pot and offered to mow our lawn. The man who waved every morning. The man who, beneath it all, had something broken inside him the rest of us never saw. And that's what haunts me the most. Not the fire, not the screams, not even the dead animals. It's the quiet ones, the ones who smile and wave and never raise their voice, because you never really know what they're capable of, until it's too late. Thank you for listening to these chilling neighbor horror stories. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Mr. Rainy Night for more true horror stories every week.